Welcome to Your City on Community 7 Television. I'm Schutz Wies and I'm your host. Each month we look at a different aspect of what's going on in the city of Billings. This month we get to be out here in beautiful Pioneer Park and we're going to talk to Officer Katie Nash. Katie works in the domestic violence program with the City of Billings Police Department. Katie, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we're going to talk about your role in domestic violence with the Billings Police Department. Before we do that, let's get a little background about you. Did you grow up in the area? Did you come to the area? Give us some background along those lines.
So I grew up over by Bozeman in Manhattan, very small town. I went to college in Great Falls, Montana, and then I've been working here with the Billings Police Department.
All right. And when did you kind of know, I want to go into law enforcement? This is something that's of interest to me.
I think I probably started thinking about it in high school, and it just seemed like, I think it's something you hear a lot. I wanted to help people, but it also felt like being able to be a part of a community within the community, and that appealed to me.
Okay. And we'll talk about this later, but then as you were on the Billings Police Department, what kind of drew you into, hey, I'd like to work on the domestic violence side of things?
In college, I actually worked at a domestic violence shelter in Great Falls, the Great Falls YWCA shelter. And so I just had a background in it and experience working with victims, and so it just fit.
Okay. And how did you get recruited to the Billings Police Department? How did you decide, hey, I'm gonna come to Billings and I'm gonna be a part of the police department here?
I was applying with several different agencies, but my husband's family is actually from Laurel, and so we kind of had our eye on this area as a focus, and they hired me. So.
All right. And when you started with the police department, was it just as a patrol officer, or kind of walk us through what you were doing when you started with the police department?
I did start just as a patrol officer, like everyone starts out, spent a year on night shift, worked on afternoons. And then about 6 years into my career is when they opened up the domestic violence investigator position as a full-time position. And like I said, with my experience, it just seemed like a fit. So that's when I moved over.
Okay. Was that a position that was already there, or that was a new position that they opened up at that time?
It was a new position. Prior to that, the city attorney's office had some grant funding that would pay officers to work overtime shifts doing domestic violence investigations, but they did not have a full-time officer. So this was a brand new position, and it's been mine from the get-go.
All right. And what is that role designed to be over and above, okay, this officer gets a call, he goes there, it's a domestic violence situation. Okay, they were the one that was called to that situation, so it's now their case. How is what you do different than how it was done before?
Domestic violence assaults and those types of cases are so much more complex than just a simple assault or any other kind of stranger on stranger crime. So a lot of times there's a lot of history before the actual incident, and then a lot of times there's contact afterward. And so they take a lot more time to investigate just because of the dynamics. The victims of these crimes need some additional resources, some additional time with the people involved just to kind of work through what's happening with the case. And so it allows a more in-depth look at these cases, which a lot of times are misdemeanors, and so they wouldn't get referred up to our detectives division, and our patrol officers are so busy that they just don't have the time to spend. So.
Okay. And how does a case get to you? I mean, I'm assuming you're not out, on the beat 24/7. When an officer gets called to a domestic violence situation, I'm assuming that you have to handle it in the moment, and then where does it go from there?
Most of the time, our patrol officers refer the case to either the city or county attorney's office, either as an arrest or a warrant request. And so most of my caseload comes from the city attorney's office domestic violence unit. They look at the case, interact with the victim, and decide whether the case needs some additional follow-up or if that victim has some additional information to share. A lot of our patrol officers, though, know that I'm available if they need some help. So if they identify that this case needs some additional attention, they'll just come straight to me and say, can you take a look at this?
Okay. So are you often out during the middle of the day or whatnot, or when do you get called out?
I have I can flex my shift, but I work Mondays through Thursdays during the day shift. I've had times where victims or witnesses can't meet with me until evening, and so I'll just stick around to meet with them or go back on shift to meet. So I'm able to flex my shift to be available.
Okay, good deal. What kind of, What's a typical week like in your office? What is what's going on during the course of the week, and what do you see on? I'm sure there probably isn't really a typical week per se, but what? Give us your best slice at a typical week in your office.
Okay. So my mornings are spent a lot of times listening to jail calls. When a defendant gets arrested and goes to jail for a PFMA, they are given a no contact order, which says you cannot have any contact with the victim. They don't follow those orders. And so I check for jail calls to the victim's phone number. I check for jail calls from that defendant to family members where they may make admissions or sometimes offer defenses as far as why they're not guilty of this. So I document those. We try to do that. I try to get that done before the arraignment, which would be at 8:30, and so that's my morning most of the time. And then I address any time-sensitive issues as far as this victim needs follow-up photographs. Injuries tend to change over time, but then they fade, and so there's a small window to get that done. And then I just turn my attention to the cases that are open. The cases that I'm currently investigating take up the rest of my days. I also have a grant that I administer, and so I do the paperwork side of the grant.
Okay. How does your office interact with city attorney's office? I believe the city attorney has one or maybe two prosecutors that kind of work on this. Can you talk to us about what's at the city attorney's office, and then how do you interact with them?
Yes, so the city attorney's office has a number of prosecutors, but they only have a single prosecutor for domestic violence crimes, and that includes the assaults, the order of protection violations, stalking, all of that kind of stuff. And so I work with him and then the two victim witness specialists that are assigned to the domestic violence crimes. So their domestic violence unit is the three of them, and then I am also on their team, I guess you would say. And we staff cases on a daily basis. I speak with them multiple times a day just so we can prioritize cases, assess what needs to be done with cases, and make sure that we're all on the same page.
All right. Do you have probably not necessarily a counterpart, or the public defender's office, I would assume, is often involved with this? Do they have kind of some specialized folks in their office that are also aware of the special issues with domestic violence?
As far as the public defender's office, I don't know how they're set up. I think that they do realize that domestic violence crimes are a little bit more complex, but I don't know how they address that.
Okay. Do you tend to see the same defense attorneys over and over and over again?
I hear the same names. I don't interact a lot with the defense attorneys just because of the scope of my involvement in the case. So, yeah.
So let's talk about an investigation. What are some of the things that you're going to go investigate during the course of this case come in? We agree that this is pretty serious. What are some of the things that you're going to be looking for as you investigate that case?
As I already kind of mentioned, the jail calls from the defendant, any follow-up photos for victim injuries. Unfortunately, sometimes the victims want to recant or clarify some things about the initial statement. Just based on the traumatic nature of an assault, a lot of times victims will say, I don't think I said this to the responding officer, but I suddenly remembered all these things, which is a very normal thing to have happen. Mm-hmm. So I get follow-up statements from victims. If they're able to identify witnesses, maybe a neighbor comes forward and says, hey, are you okay? I heard this. I take witness statements and investigate any additional contact if the suspect gets out of jail and starts texting a victim or contact via Facebook or things like that. That's my job.
Is there kind of a degree of seriousness to this? I don't know, if you say 1 to 10, some of these are a 2 and some of them are a 10. And how do you, I imagine just based on your experience, know where that seriousness falls?
Mm-hmm. So I think, of course, all domestic violence is serious. Of course, yes. But decades of research have identified some red flags, mm-hmm. and those red flags, when they're present within the relationship, really can indicate a higher risk for that victim for reassault or near lethal violence. Mm-hmm. And so we look for red flags like strangulation. Is the offender violently and constantly jealous? Was there abuse during a victim's pregnancy? Has the victim just ended the relationship or thinking about ending the relationship? Because domestic violence is about power and control, if the relationship is ending, that's a loss of control for the offender, and so that raises a victim's risk. So we identify those red flags and try to not prioritize, but as we have time, we try to focus on those cases over the cases that don't have those red flags present.
Okay. Typically, how long does an investigation take for you to get there? And I imagine that it's probably has something to do with that level of seriousness on that spectrum.
Oh gosh, that's a wide variety of time. It really depends on the scope of what I'm asked to do. I have cases where the only thing I need to do is contact this victim before the offender can get out of jail to make sure she's in contact with the city attorney's office. So I go find the victim, get contact information, done. So that's a morning. Or I have cases where the suspect will not stop contacting the victim. And so those cases can go on for months as I just continue documenting contact, getting verification through cell phone records and things like that. A lot of it has to do with the suspect's behavior. If they're going to follow the court order, my investigation can be very short. If they continue their behavior, it'll last as long as they do.
I know you recently kind of started a program with the YWCA. Talk to us about what that program is and kind of what was the impetus for you guys to make that connection.
Yeah, definitely. So the program is a risk assessment, an on-scene risk assessment that the patrol officers will do. It's based on the Arizona Intimate Partner Risk Assessment Instrument System, which is a mouthful.
Yes.
And so it's called APPRAISE for short. And basically it is a list of 18 questions that the patrol officers will ask a victim in an intimate partner violence relationship on that type of scene. And if the victims score in at an elevated risk based on their answers to the questions or at high risk, the officer will make a phone call to the YWCA crisis line and let the victim have a confidential phone call with the advocate. And where that came from is working with the YWCA, I wanted to figure out how the Billings Police Department was doing as far as, are we treating victims respectfully? Are we handling cases per best practices? So I had actually asked Aaron Lambert at the YWCA to ask their in-shelter residents, completely confidential, but if you've interacted with the Billings Police Department, how did they do? What did they do well? What could they improve upon? And we found that they have very few victims who have interacted with the police department. And that's actually true nationally. So victims tend to either go with system-based services, which would be the courts and the police, or they access community-based services, counselors, shelters, advocates. But their outcomes can be a lot better if they access both avenues of service. I can't make shelter victims contact the police department if they don't want to, but I can put system-based victims in contact with the shelter. And so that's where that came from. We decided we needed some method to link our victims, the police department victims, with the shelter services.
All right. Did you, in the course of doing that, did you find that those that act, through the court system didn't realize that the community stuff was available and vice versa, or there was a lack of interest in accessing one or the other?
I think it's a little of both. The program is still in the very beginning phases, and so it's a little hard to say here locally, but I think it has to do with not being aware of the services that exist, or like you said, maybe you don't want to call the police, maybe you don't want to get involved in the criminal justice system, and so you're just going to stay away from it.
Right. So those that are in the, the community services, give us maybe some of the reasons why they wouldn't necessarily want to contact the police. This happened and everyone knows it's not a good thing, but I don't really want to call the police. Fill in the blank for us there.
The criminal justice system is not a victim-friendly place. It's about holding offenders accountable, and so the victims tend to get lost in the shuffle. It's difficult to provide victims with the resources and the services and the support that they need, just because the offender accountability part is a big job. And so it's not a fun place to be. And if you don't understand the system, it's very confusing, it's very scary, it almost re-victimizes these victims. So I don't think I would want, it's not a fun place to find yourself. So I think it's a lot easier sometimes to just handle it through the community-based services and not involve the criminal justice system. Or we have victims with their own legal issues, substance abuse issues, that don't like the police. We're kind of like a private sector business where if you've heard bad stuff about officers from friends or your own experiences, you're not going to want to call them.
Sure. Did you find that, though, that the YWCA was receptive to maybe having those avenues open, and they would maybe like to see more of their clients utilize it if they're the ones that just didn't even know about that these services were available?
I think so. The Y is definitely supportive of us referring our victims to them. And I think when they feel like it's appropriate and necessary, they always ask their victims, would you like to, we can help you talk to the police, we can help you file this report, or just go through an order of protection through the courts. They're always willing to help the victims do that if that's what they want to do.
Okay. Do they have some lawyers on staff or legal team on staff that can do those kind of easy to do parts of the process?
They do have one attorney on staff, and she helps filling out those types of orders. I think, I guess I can't really speak for her, but I think she does more limited scope type of things where she can answer some questions and things like that, but not represent somebody in a hearing.
Okay. And then what are you guys kind of paying attention to, both from your perspective and from the WISE perspective? What are you guys trying to pay attention to over the first year or two of this kind of relationship to see what's working, what's not working, and what we can do better as you guys work together?
In its infancy, we're just trying to pay attention to, does the process work? Is it causing a problem for the YWCA? Is it causing some kind of problem in the paperwork system for patrol? Do we need to tweak anything? I know some of the prosecutors at the county attorney's office have asked victims who've participated in the appraise interview, how did that feel? Did you like it? Did you not like it? And so far, the victims have been pretty positive about it.
Sure.
And so just trying to make sure that we're not doing something that's going to cause more harm than good is where our attention is right now.
Okay. And what about the patrol officers? Did they kind of like to have this ability, I suppose, before they maybe felt a little hamstrung on, well, what do I do in this situation?
Right. I think that they don't dislike it. I have not heard any negative feedback about it, and I think a lot of the officers do feel like it's a way for them to be able to hand over victim care to someone who's trained to provide victim care and let them handle the suspect accountability part.
Okay. Any other aspect of your kind of your partnership with the Y that we didn't touch on that you would like to touch on?
I don't think so. I think that we have a pretty good relationship. It's difficult sometimes for officers to realize the confidentiality aspect of the YWCA, and it feels silly to drop a victim off there, turn around 5 minutes later and say, oh, I need to talk to her, and to have the advocate say, I can't tell you whether she's here or not here. Right. But once the officers understand that confidentiality is tied to their funding, it's what they have to do. We don't expect any different from the hospitals or places like that. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Over the last few months, we've all been affected in some way or another by the COVID pandemic. I know one of the things that you hear is that the downside of this has maybe been people being more close together, and that there's been an uptick in domestic violence. Have you guys seen that at the Billings Police Department?
I think that we have. I guess I can say I'm lucky enough that my caseload gets filtered through the city attorney's office. And so when they get very, very busy, they tend to assign me fewer things to do because they don't have time to think about it. And so my caseload hasn't increased drastically, but because I work with them on a daily basis, I know that they're seeing almost double what they would normally see at this time of year. So I know that it's increased.
Okay. Anything about how the pandemic's been handled with the social distancing and the telework and all that kind of stuff that you've seen take place in what you do on a daily basis that you might use going forward? Like, hey, this actually worked pretty good.
Not that I can think of. It's been hard to staff cases.
Yeah.
A lot of times the city attorney's office would just have victims drop by, and that would lead us to some additional investigation. And when they're not able to do that, I think there's probably some things we're missing.
Right. So you're missing out on that kind of interaction and that kind of stuff as well.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Very good. Going forward, I know we talked about the Y issue, but are there other programs that you'd like to see implemented in the police department that deal with domestic violence?
I know that the Bozeman Police Department has a domestic violence high-risk response team where they have, probably similar to what we have, but they can sit down, staff each case, and figure out how best to move forward with each case. Our caseload is so much higher than theirs, though. We can't quite get our feet under us enough to be able to take a step back and assess each case from ground up. And so to either have some additional bodies working in the domestic violence division, some additional prosecutors would then be necessary, but really to be able to dig into these high-risk cases beyond just triage mode.
Sure. All right. Do you know other departments that are about the same size as Billings how many officers do they usually have that are focused on domestic violence?
That is a good question. I think that most comparable agencies do have at least a domestic violence investigator, but I don't really have numbers on that.
Sure. Do you get a chance much to network with other domestic violence officers across the country and see what programs are going on? And I'm assuming that's how you learned about the Arizona program as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I get to network. We try to get to a national conference once a year to do that exact thing, and that is where I heard about Appraise. Um, and again, because those departments tend to be a lot bigger, like Arizona uses Appraise when victims score in elevated or high risk, they get referred for follow-up investigation to their domestic violence unit. Obviously, that wouldn't work here because it would just be me trying to get through all these cases. And so having a unit or a high-risk unit or some multiple people in place would be helpful, and that seems to be the direction that a lot of large agencies go.
Sure. Talk to us about what is your jurisdiction. Is it just the city of Billings, Yellowstone County? Where is it that you're going to interact with those victims?
My jurisdiction follows along with the Billings Police Department jurisdiction, and so any crime that happens within the city, it's handled by the city. The Billings Police Department is something that I can get involved in, whether it's misdemeanor or felony. And a lot of times the misdemeanor cases that I investigate can turn into felonies when additional abuse is discovered or witness tampering happens. And so the level of crime as far as misdemeanor or felony doesn't matter for my purposes, but I'm limited to City of Billings.
All right. Do you find that you kind of work with the same offenders and you kind of know who's out there, or is it you never know who is going to be an offender and that case is going to cross your desk and you would say, man, I would have never guessed?
There are a lot of offenders who I think traditionally you wouldn't assume that they were going to, they have high paying jobs, they have status, and so you would never guess. So we have a lot of offenders from all parts of the city, but we also have a collection of kind of frequent flyers, we like to call them, where it's names that we know, either the same or different victim, but it's the same guy doing the same thing.
Sure. And then do you guys work with the ones that are kind of repetitive? Are there victims processes that you try to work through and say, hey, there's a pattern here and you're kind of repeating it. Let me help you see what's going on here?
We do try to, and that's been kind of the focus of the City Attorney's Office Domestic Violence Unit, in that we're probably not going to be able to change these offenders. But if we can help this victim work through these barriers to leaving the relationship or identifying red flags in a new relationship, we want the victim to come away better than before, at least not worse off than before. And so we do try our best to work with the victims that we're seeing to help them get out or stay safe with whatever situation they're in.
All right. Talk to us about what are some of those barriers. What are some of the common barriers you see where that victim is not able to get over that barrier to get out of a situation that's just not healthy?
So I know, working with some civil attorneys, family law attorneys, and the YWCA, I know housing and childcare and legal representation for custody issues are some major barriers. But really any aspect of the relationship that makes it abusive, like isolation, control of the finances, threats, verbal, emotional abuse, all of those tactics work. And those are things that victims have to overcome. If you don't have access to your own finances, how are you going to leave? If you're isolated from friends and family, where are you going to go? So just helping them overcome the violence within the relationship, the abuse in all its forms, is the trick.
All right. And is that some of the things that the Y does, is kind of help with those barriers that are out there? What programs do they have in place to help with those barriers?
Yeah, definitely. That is what they're all about. So they have they offer counseling. They have a housing, I think they call her a housing navigator, to help victims find affordable housing. They have their domestic violence shelter, their transitional housing, and their legal services. And then they can help with any other referrals. If they can't offer it in-house, they can help a victim figure out where to go.
Okay. All right. Well, Officer Nash, thank you so much for coming on today. We really appreciate all of the information and all of the hard work you do for the city of Billings. I know there's probably days where it's not a really fun job, but it's good work, and we really appreciate that you are putting such hard work into doing this for our city.
Yeah, thank you. No problem.